All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Hilla webinar. With me, I've got Leif Åstrand. Hello.
Hello.
And you are, if I'm not mistaken, the one of the product managers behind Hilla.
That's absolutely right. It was almost with me it started, but then I've been doing a whole bunch of other things in between. But now I'm back here again to talk about it.
Awesome. And huge congratulations on getting it out. I know it's been kind of a long time coming, and it's been kind of included in the Vaadin platform for a while, but now it's kind of its own thing.
Yep.
And because of that, I think it was kind of worth for us to have this live stream and just talk about why you personally thought that the world needed another framework, since there are so many from before. So kind of just dig into the ideas behind why we built Hilla in the first place.
Yep.
And of course, because we are developers and we're talking to, I assume, mostly developers, we're going to tell this story mostly through code.
Exactly.
So anyway, do you want to get us started and just share a little bit of the history behind Hilla and how it came to be and what kind of problems we're solving with it?
Yeah, that sounds like an excellent plan. So yeah, it was kind of we at Vaadin, we have been building a web application development framework for almost or over 20 years already. But we were also thinking kind of maybe we should do something different. No, that wasn't really how it was. But we observed that because Vaadin is only for developers who use only Java, but we were also seeing that lots of people preferred to mix, of course, front-end and back-end technologies. So from that, we kind of started thinking about what could we contribute to that space. And because the one thing that we have that is quite our own thing is that we very much focus on developer productivity, and we'll see more about that when we actually dig into the code also. So maybe you should just get started with kicking off a Hilla project.
I will do that if you want to explain to us, meanwhile, what a Hilla is and what it has to do with Vaadins.
Yep. So Hilla is now it's a cloudberry. That's the English name of it. So it's one of the native berries that grow here in the forests in Finland, and we're also otherwise at Vaadin from Finland. And for instance, our logo with the angle and curly braces, that's actually also represents a reindeer and so on. So we kind of a little bit go back to our Finnish roots also with the name of this framework.
Yeah, they definitely live in the same place up north, both the cloudberries and the reindeer. All right, so what I'm thinking that we would do here is we're going to use the CLI to just create a new project, and then we're just going to walk through a couple of different things here, and as we go through them, maybe Leif, you can give a little bit of like a director's commentary on what we're seeing, why things work that specific way, and of course, if we have any questions coming in from the audience as we're doing this, we'll try to answer. So I'm going to kickstart the project creation here. We're creating a new app, and it's going to be called a grocery app. We're going to cd into the folder here, and I'm going to open it with VS Code. So I'll just type in code like that, and then I'm going to go ahead and use the included Maven wrapper to start it. So the default target is just starting the included Spring Boot application, and then if we go to localhost on port 8080, we'll see that there's a front-end development build running here. And once that finishes, we have the application up and running. Obviously, not a whole lot here to see right now. I think since we're living on the edge here, I want to make a small change here already. So I'm going to use Vite here for front-end development. Can you briefly explain what I just did and why somebody might want to do that?
Yeah, so what you did was that you enabled a feature flag that's for an experimental feature that we believe is ready enough to be used, but there's still some rough edges that we're finalizing. But the whole point of using Vite for the front end build is just that it's very, very fast to incrementally react to any changes we do.
Good. All right, and I'm very happy I actually remember to bump up the font size here in my app before we started coding, and everyone complaining they can't see anything. So as I'm looking at the project here, something strikes me. Like, obviously it's one project, but it has this front end folder, but then it has the standard Maven source main Java folder here. So can you talk a little bit about this whole setup?
Yeah, we will actually, I think we'll come back to that also later when we look at code examples. But really, one of the core ideas we have with Hilla is that front-end development and server backend development, they kind of fit together because it just makes things easier, that we will see down the line. And that has actually been one of the central things around Hilla, kind of how can we benefit from allowing them to be good together, even though conventional wisdom is that they should be separated. But there's also different opinions on how much sense that makes.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see a kind of a strong opinion in the contrary to what maybe many people assume how you're quote unquote supposed to build client-side applications, where you have a very strict separation between your backend, whether that's a REST service or a GraphQL or something, and then your front end. So what we claim and what we believe is that by having these two things live in the same project and kind of assume that they're going to be tightly integrated will allow us to make a lot of things easier that would be quite difficult when you have these two things as completely separate.
That's right. And well, half of the point here is just to show what goes on there. So I think we should start with something really, really simple, because very much about what we have with Hilla is how do you again combine this server-side Java and client-side JavaScript, or actually TypeScript that we're using. So that's really about communication between server and client. So let's create a grocery endpoint, because, well, this is a grocery example. But first, we could just do a really simple hello world. So if you add just endpoint annotation there, and then anonymous allowed also to, just for this example, bypass the security checks to make things easier.
Yeah, I think it's good to kind of point out that by default, all endpoints kind of block access, and you have to explicitly tell who should be able to access an endpoint, just so the default is secure in a way.
Yeah, and that also means that just by looking at this class, you immediately know what's the access control for it. You don't need to dig through any kind of separate configurations or anything. But yeah, let's do a hello world. Oh, you already started. So we get in a message string, and then we return another string, which is just, well, server says, and then it echoes back the thing.
Very, very advanced stuff here.
Yeah. And
so do you want to just start with a console log before we get too far into everything?
Let's do things really simple here. So in the index.ts file, it's got a bunch of other things to set up, routing and so on, but we won't look at those now. But yeah, what we can do now when we have that endpoint, because again, we really combine the Java and the TypeScript. So based on the Java class we have, we generate a TypeScript thing that you can import also, that we have there right now. So if you just import that one, and then on that immediately we get automatically with type completion, we get the method that we defined on the server side.
I can see this takes in a string. So say hello world, because what else would I say?
Yeah. And then that thing returns. Can we use top level await in this context?
No.
Oh, well,
we'll get to that when we get to the view. But I think the thing to take away from here is that the communication is asynchronous and non-blocking by nature. So when we call the server, we're not kind of blocking the UI for that. We can await for something to happen, and then we can react to that. We'll get
you get a message and then call back that, just console log that message, I guess. Yeah, that's easy enough.
Right. And then
No, it refreshes
obviously we need to open up the console.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the server says, hello world.
Yes.
So we went from here to our endpoint and back. But what was pretty cool is that if we look at what we imported here, we just imported this generated thing. So it looks in the TypeScript code like we're calling a TypeScript method, but over kind of magically behind the scenes, we're actually going over the wire and calling the server. So that's pretty neat. All right. Do you want to build something more meaningful, or are we happy with this?
I could maybe make a couple of kind of architect's observations from this also, because, well, like I already said, this is really, it's creating coupling between your client side and your server side code. But one of the things we have been observing is that communication over the network, that's already difficult enough on its own. We don't need to introduce any additional kind of complications there also. So in that way, we believe in this architectural pattern called backends for frontends, BFF. You can also say it's best friends forever. That the whole idea is that your backend, the kind of topmost layer, so to say, of your backend, could and should be customized to your client side need. If you have multiple different clients, like you have a web client and you have, I don't know, a mobile client, and you have maybe some third-party integrations and whatnot, then each of them probably has slightly different needs also for what exactly, how they request things and so on. And that's why it makes sense to make each of them as a separate thing, and also so that it's the team that builds the front end. They also maintain the topmost layer of the back end. If you want to, you can have full-blown feature teams that own the whole stack for each use case, but you can also have it so that the front end team, if you have separate front end teams, that the front end team is responsible for the very topmost part of the server side layer, and then all the services and so on that you use from that kind of backend layer, that can then be kind of managed by the actual backend team, so to say.
Sure. So, I mean, to bring things to a more concrete level, you're saying that the front end team would essentially build this endpoint that we're looking at here, and it would then call services that could be provided by either a backend person in the same team or a separate backend team, maybe even.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, all of that sounds very good. As a lazy developer, what makes me very happy is that I get autocomplete on all the method names and signatures, so I don't like typo things. And obviously, when I change something, that gets reflected.
Yep.
So let's jump into the front end here. And I think since we're building a grocery app, I think what we'll need is some kind of form to enter grocery items, and then we probably need some place to kind of display them, right?
Yeah, to view your shopping list also. But let's start with just the form. So
Right, so can you tell us what we're looking at right now?
We are looking at, well, obviously the grocery view TypeScript file. It's a class, and it uses lit as the rendering library. So it's a way of doing web components. So every view on your application is a separate web component. So here we have grocery dash view. That's actually, if you open the DOM inspector, you will see that there is an element with that name somewhere hiding there inside main layout, inside grocery view. Yeah. So what we're looking at is the implementation of that custom HTML element, and that is then the view that we see.
Yeah.
And you might be wondering here also kind of what's the point with these web components? What's the point with using lit for rendering? And the point is really that web components, they're really universal. You can use the same component with basically any front-end library, rendering library, and the other way around also. We at Vaadin, we are building one set of web components, but you can just as well either use our web components with some other library, or the other way around, use use Hilla with some other set of web components if you want.
While you're talking, I'll start importing some of the ones that I think will. So I think one of the strengths of Hilla is that not only do you get this full stack thing framework that combines the front end and the back end, but you also get this library of components that makes just building these professional looking UIs pretty fast. So I'll take the login number field, because we'll have a kind of the item that we're adding, how many of those, and then we'll have a button.
And now I see there's a question online. Roland Kruger is asking, on what is TypeScript code generation based? Does it use Java bytecode, or is it based on the source code, like for instance the Git cross compiler? Actually, the version we're seeing right now uses parses Java code, but we're actually for the next version we are building a new parser generator thing that instead uses primarily bytecode, but it also supplements with reading Java, for instance, for getting if you have Java docs on your endpoint methods, then it also makes that into the TypeScript, and in that way you can see more about what you kind of get more information there. But so today it uses Java code, but very soon, maybe 3 months from now, I think based on the roadmap, we would have a version that actually uses bytecode instead as the primary thing. And that, for instance, makes it possible to have multi-module support in a sensible way. It makes it possible to use Kotlin if you prefer that also.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. So while you were talking, I added 3 components here: one text field, number field, and a button. And they showed up here. Showed up probably a slightly confusing place, and that's because of all this configuration or these helper classes that we had here. So we'll remove the centering here.
Great.
Makes more sense. All right, and then I'll also add that Vaadin grid here, and we'll get back to that when we actually have some data. But of course, for this to be a meaningful app, we probably need to have some kind of backend for it where we can actually save our grocery list.
I agree.
Good.
So that's one observation, that we're constantly jumping back and forth between front end and back end code here. And again, if you would have a kind of, well, I wouldn't maybe say typical, but stereotypical development setup where you have the front end and the back end separated, then each of one of these back and forths would probably be an hour of meetings to agree on how should we do things. And that's kind of what we want to avoid here.
All right, so I'm going to actually set up a little in-memory database for us so that we can like see the whole thing from database to view layer. So I'll
all right.
add
and at the same time, go ahead.
So I'm adding an H2 database dependency and Spring Boot starter JPA, and that's probably a good reminder that we are in fact in a Spring Boot application here.
Yep.
And
yeah, and we're using Spring Boot because it's the de facto standard right now in the backend world, and we really appreciate how it gives you access to everything. Basically, in the Java ecosystem, you have immediate access. It's kind of more common that not that there's already a Spring Boot integration with it, which means that you don't need to care about any configuration at all unless you really want to. So for instance, here we got the database, we got the JPA integration, everything. Actually, we're not using those yet, but they are there immediately configured without anything extra from our side.
Yeah. Some things that I do want to configure in our data model here, I want to make some kind of validation constraints. So for instance, the name should not be blank, right? So we have to like actually add something. And if we add something, we probably want a non-negative amount of those, right?
Yep. I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
so if it shouldn't be negative, then the minimum value is 1, I guess.
I think your math is correct. Yeah. Good job.
Yep.
And then we'll generate some boilerplate like that. And that gives us a data model. Now, to access the database, we'll use just a Spring Data repository. So we'll call this grocery repository. And this will be an interface that extends from the APA repository. And here we give two types here. So the first one is the grocery item, and the second one is the type ID. Right? Are you happy with that? Did I do something horribly wrong? Hopefully not.
It looks great. You might want to add not null also to those, but maybe we can manage without that.
Yeah. Well, I like to live dangerously.
All right,
so
let's do it that way.
So since we are in a Spring application, we can probably auto wire in things into our endpoint here to kind of get access to the rest of the application.
Yep.
We'll do a constructor injection here. So we'll take the grocery repository repo. I'll call it repo because typing repository and talking at the same time is surprisingly difficult.
Yep, and like we see also here, like these endpoints, they are full-blown Spring Beans. You can auto-wire things in. Okay, you don't even need to mention auto-wired here, but it does everything you would expect from Spring Beans. We've got a couple of questions while Marcus is typing simple things here. Norbert Herzeg is asking, what are your expectations with regards to large projects? What's the ideal repository setup which can support multiple people or maybe multiple teams working on the same application? So this goes back to a little bit what I said about the next version that we're working on would use bytecode instead of Java as the primary thing for the TypeScript generation, and that in itself will enable a multi-module setup, because otherwise you would have to do really weird things to help the generator find the Java sources. But with the upcoming version, we will enable and also document how you do a multi-module Maven setup, so that different parts of the application can be worked on in separate places and still bringing everything together. So what have you done now? I guess we don't see any difference.
No. So, well, one thing that I realized I had to do was restart the server since we added some dependencies to our POM, and I failed to do that earlier, so I had to do that. Okay. But in addition to that, I used this injected repo here to expose two methods, one for just finding all the grocery items that we have, and one for saving. And then I added some of these non-nulls. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why we wanted to add those.
Yeah, that's an interesting. It's been a struggle. There's no good way, because in Java we have one default that things can be null, and then on the TypeScript side there's kind of the opposite default, that if you don't have any nulls, then everything is so much easier to do. So to make those two ends worlds meet, we have to do it so that if you don't have non-null there, then the TypeScript type will be that it might be null, and then you will end up with lots of warnings or errors. So that's what we're explicitly saying also to the Java side, that we don't expect anything to be null there.
Good. So I'm back in the view here, and let's jump into some reactive coding. That's always fun, right? So I'm going to define a state for our component. And while I'm typing again, you can maybe explain what's going on.
Yep. So reactive here means kind of that whenever the data here changes, so when the grocery items instance field changes, then the lit element base class that actually the view class inherits from it will automatically take care of rendering a new version of the template that in a really efficient way just changes things that actually depend on the state. So we're not using that state yet in any of the code you're typing, but we'll get there really soon. About that kind of reactive approach, it's very much the standard way if you are building anything with front-end technologies today. So all the frameworks have that nowadays. But if you, for instance, compare it with server-side rendering, for instance, time leaf templates or something, then it's quite a difference, because with this, we don't need to do a separate round trip to the server every time something changes, but instead it's just a very, very small incremental change. And that, again, it's making everything smoother, especially for the end users when they don't need to wait for the page to reload.
Yeah, so maybe I can explain a little bit what I typed here while you were talking. So yeah, we have the state here. So we're saying essentially our grocery items state will be of type grocery item array. So that's something that was automatically generated for us because we exposed that from the endpoint. We start off with just having an empty array of no grocery items. And then in the template here, the template's always kind of what's shown in the view is always just a kind of a function of the state. So we're saying that the grid should always show as its items whatever we have in the grocery items. And if we change what's in the grocery items, then the grid will update accordingly, right?
Yep.
Right. And then I'm going to go here to the connected callback, which is called whenever we actually instantiate this view and add it to the DOM. And now we can get to that async that you were talking about. So there's an easier way perhaps to kind of work with asynchronous code by using this async and await. So we can say that this dot grocery items will be equal to await. So we wait for the answer to come back and then we assign this. So it looks like we're doing just kind of sequential code, but under the hood, this will kind of non-blockingly wait for the endpoint to return. So we'll call the grocery endpoint, import that, and then we'll call find all, just initialize with whatever we have in the database when we start. Now, of course, we don't have anything there yet. So I think for that, we need to fix this whole form so we have a way of adding things. So for that, we're going to create a binder. That will be a new binder. Takes in two things: the element that contains the form, and then this grocery item model. So what's the difference between the model and the grocery item itself?
Well, the main thing is that the model it's just metadata. It describes, it's a JSON object-ish that describes what are the actual properties in this thing, and also with a whole bunch of fancy TypeScript magic for us to be able to autocomplete things and so on.
Yeah.
So here we get to the actual magic. For this field, or for the body number field, we use, or for both of the fields, we use the field directive. That's a lit feature, and we just tell which part of the model of this binder is it that this thing is, and the model that's then the grocery item model that we got from this .binder a couple of lines up, which we in turn passed into the binder.
Yeah. So I guess we need a way to kind of trigger the validation. That happens, I think, when we try to submit. So we still need to kind of hook up this button. But you could already see there's like a little dot here indicating that this is a required field. So can't be blank. We must have more than one item. So we can see that some of those validations that we defined in our Java model are already being applied here.
Yep.
All right.
And
so then
the way that works is that it's actually, when you have that server-side entity, the grocery item model that is generated TypeScript based on that class, it also contains information about those validation annotations, which means that you automatically get TypeScript. You get client-side validation automatically based on the server-side Java rules that you have.
So while you were talking, what I did was I bound the click event of the button to this.add item, and then here I started kind of implementing this. So I'm telling the binder to submit the form to our endpoint. So we're call it grocery endpoint, the save method there. And if you remember, the save method takes in a grocery item, so the types match up there. And then if we get back a saved item, yep. So TypeScript saved the world here. Because
oh, you forgot
actually
to wait.
assigned that to the promise and not to the value returned from the promise when it's completed. So I would have had a bug in my code if I if TypeScript hadn't told me that I'm being dumb. All right, so if we do get a item back, what we can do is we can append it to this array. Now, how the change detection works is that it actually looks at the reference. So if we just did kind of what might be the initial thought that you have, so we would take like this dot grocery items dot push, and we would add the saved here. That wouldn't actually re-render because it's just looking at which instance of an array is attached here. So what we actually want to do is we want to quickly create a new array with all the items that we had from before, and then the saved item appended to it like this. And then we can also tell the binder to clear itself so that we're ready to import the next item. So this should work now. Is that what we think, Leif?
I think it hopes. I used to say that if you type Java, if you type Java and it compiles, then it works. And the same also goes with TypeScript, apparently.
Yeah. Eggs. I don't like to buy full cartons of eggs. I just prefer odd numbers of eggs.
That's the way we roll it.
All right, so that worked. Do you think we can reload? Yeah, so we can actually reload this to show that it's coming from the database. So when we restart or reload the UI, it's calling this endpoint to find everything in the database and initialize.
Yeah. We've got a bunch of questions that could be quite great to take at this moment also.
Yeah, shoot.
We got Ricardo Legorezza, who asked, do you have an example for Spring Authorization Server 002 with Vaadin Hilla? I guess that's what we have. If you go to hilla.dev/docs, and in the menu there's security, so that shows integrating with Spring Security, and it uses all the fancy JWT stuff and such things behind the scenes.
Go to this stateless authentication section for
that's
the
true.
JWT stuff.
Yeah, but that should describe what you're asking about. Then we got actually a whole bunch of questions about Grid. Does it support? The Grid also supports data provider instead of items. Does it also support lazy loading, unknown size, same as Flow does? And then there's other quick Grid questions. Does Grid support pagination? And does Grid support lazy loading and prefetch? So yes, the simple example we showed here uses an in-memory list of items with the Grid. You can also use a data provider. So just give it callbacks to fetch data. It also, because it's the same Grid that you use with Vaadin Flow, so it supports all the same things. You just configure it from TypeScript instead of from Java, and you got all the same features. Pagination isn't one of the features. So there you have a video on how to do that exactly. I guess this is with Hilla also, although I guess the video says Fusion.
It's with Fusion, which is probably good to mention that this used to be called Vaadin Fusion up until last week. So you can still find a lot of relevant content if you look for that.
Yeah. The grid doesn't do pagination. You can do that manually. There's even an add-on in the Vaadin directory for it. But yes, it does support lazy loading with the kind of infinite scrolling approach. You can just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. It just fetches more and more data. It prefetches, that was also one of the questions, it prefetches a bunch of rows ahead also, so that in most cases, you won't ever even notice that it loads anything.
Yeah.
All right, I think that there was all the questions right now.
Yeah, well, there was kind of a sort of a question that touched on another question, like, does this work the same way as Flow does? So maybe you want to talk a little bit about what's the kind of relationship between the two frameworks that we now have and how they're related to each other.
Yeah, before we get really to that, I want to talk about another thing actually, because what we've been kind of summarizing, what we've been seeing here so far, is that by combining TypeScript and Java, mostly generating TypeScript code from Java code, what we have is something that really, really optimizes the productivity of developers. Because one of the reasons we built Hilla also is that we really believe that when you build typical, so to say, business applications, then you have lots and lots and lots of use cases. You have basically lots of business processes that need to be covered. And at the same time, you typically don't have terribly many users. You have kind of hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of users, but probably not a billion users like you would have if you would be building the next Netflix or something. And that means that we can really optimize so that productivity of the developer, that's the most important thing. And it's not like we say that it's not at all important to be efficient on the server and so on, but it's not the topmost priority. And that's something that is specifically for building business type of web applications. And this is something we have learned throughout the years from building Vaadin Flow, the framework for doing exactly this kind of application, but only with Java instead. And we continue building both Flow and Hilla side by side. And actually, to be honest, Flow is the bigger focus for us from an engineering point of view, even though right now today, when Hilla is new, that's where our focus is, kind of here on the webinar and so on. But still, we're very much still also working with Flow to help all those people who want to build these business web applications using only Java, and well, you can optimize things with some front-end stuff also, but it's not in any way necessary.
Yeah, well, I think one of the big benefits of this new kind of split that we have, where Hilla lives in one place and Flow lives in another, is that we can kind of, both teams in a way can focus really on exactly those things that are relevant for those users, and also kind of in terms of when you're searching for information as you're developing, if you're like previously, if you looked for Vaadin binder, you could, depending on SEO, you could find either the Flow binder or the Fusion binder, and that was a little bit of kind of confusion, if you will, if you pardon the pun. But now, of course, if you search for Hilla binder, you will immediately find just the Hilla docs, and that also means, like, when you're here in the docs and you do Command K and you start searching for, I don't know, login, this is all scoped just to this one framework, which again makes it easier to just kind of stay in that place where you are right then, what you're interested in doing. Of course, we're still kind of support the hybrid use case where you might want to add a couple of either like client-side views to a server-side Flow application or the other way around. But for the most part, we believe that people will kind of fall into mainly one or the other camp.
That's right. I'm seeing we have one more question that I haven't answered, and that's from Peter Seitz, who asks, where can I get the book of Hilla?
Right now, the book of Hilla is the Hilla doc site. So would really kind of recommend going here. Like there's still definitely things that we need to kind of improve here, but I think especially the tutorial section is quite in depth already. We have a full-blown tutorial showing you how to build a fully functional CRM application that works offline for most part, kind of deals with some relationships and kind of displaying data in different ways using application state management through MobX, and kind of touches on kind of going from that kind of initial hello world one kind of view application to a more meaningful big application. So there's a lot of good stuff here already in the Hilla docs.
Yep. Now we have Martin Lopez asking, what about the roadmap? What are the biggest things that you're working right now that will shape the future of the library? As I mentioned, the very next thing is the new TypeScript generator that uses bytecode instead of Java sources as that's the primary source, and that would then also enable multi-module support, among other things. Another big thing, I mean, in general, we think that Hilla does everything you need right now. One thing that we have been talking about very much is to get server push support. So that you can also, from the server, send updates to the client without having to have the client ask for them. So that's another big thing that we plan to get under development. We had a really good prototype on Twitter just yesterday about that also.
Yeah, it's a good mention here. So if you subscribe to the Hilla framework Twitter account, you'll find a link to that cool prototype with the server push, or kind of reactive endpoints, if you will.
Yep. And now we got lots of questions here.
Good. We managed to confuse everyone, Leif. Good job.
What? Yeah, okay, yeah. I didn't answer all the questions up front. So we have Andreas Maschke, who asks, what are the plans with Vaadin Design System Publisher with still build a design system which contains both Flow and Hilla documentation? That's an excellent question. I guess so. We haven't discussed it, but probably yes, because we are also, I mean, we are using the same design system publisher for doing the component documentation on Vaadin.com, where we show, for instance, the Vaadin grid, both for TypeScript and for Java users. So yeah, I guess it won't change.
Yeah. And do you know of a lightweight cloud hosting solution where you can just drop a Vaadin bundle and start serving web content?
I don't know. Maybe you know, Marcus.
I think the closest that comes to mind is Heroku. It's
right.
very straightforward to just kind of use either the CLI or set up a GitHub kind of workflow that just publishes apps. And yeah, I think Hill apps they start up pretty quickly. There's not as much, I think, kind of going on as they start up. So they're, even though Heroku is quite aggressive at kind of spinning down servers, they do get up pretty fast. Do you think, kind of speaking of getting started quick, do you think like supporting things like Spring Native might be on the roadmap, or even like just investigation type of roadmap for Hilla?
Potentially, yes. I mean, we really want to listen to what the users want to have, and so far I don't remember anyone specifically saying that they would be in particular interested in Spring.
Hey,
Spring
I
Native.
did.
Okay,
I'm somebody.
Well, I don't know if you count as a user, but it's certainly a possibility. It really depends on how much interest there is in different possibilities there. I don't see any architectural reason for why it wouldn't wouldn't work.
Yeah, and I think kind of related to our earlier deployment discussion, Roland was asking if he understood correctly that there's no need for a HTTP session with Hilla, and that you essentially can write stateless Hilla applications, and that is correct.
Yep.
What about Hilla and Quarkus? We get a question from Victor's here.
It's truly the same as with Spring Native. We don't have any specific plans for it. It really depends on. We could always say that it's a battle. Is there more interest for Quarkus or Spring Native? And based on whichever is more interested, or people is more interested in, then that's probably the one we would be building first.
So for Quarkus, actually, it's slightly ahead because there is a GitHub issue here. If you go to the FAQ and click on this GitHub issue here, you can go and thumb up this issue to kind of help signal to us that this is something that would be interesting to you. And of course, like hearing from people and getting signals on what's interesting and important to you is something that can help us focus our efforts on the right things.
Yep. We're getting more questions here. I am working with Vaadin 14. Will this work with it? No, it won't. This used to be Vaadin Fusion, which was added in Vaadin 15, and then has been growing since then. Starting from Vaadin 23, that will be released next week. No, next week actually, I think. Hilla will be a standalone thing, so it kind of follows the same version release cycle, but it's a separate thing. You can very easily integrate them, but with Vaadin 14 there isn't a good way of integrating them, so kind of they wouldn't clash, but you would have a hard time using them together to get one unified UI that uses some views from Hilla and some from
I guess the kind of good news though is that going from Vaadin 14 to 23 and kind of getting access to being able to use a Hilla hybrid app is fairly straightforward. There weren't that many breaking changes between 14 and 23 in terms of the Java API.
Yeah.
All right. Did we have any more questions, or should we start wrapping up here?
I think I see one more question. How could you build a configurable app, for instance, configurable grid columns, renderers, and more? Would you fetch the config from an endpoint in render? Yeah, well, not in render, but in the connected callback that Marcus already showed. That's a good place to fetch it. You could also, for that kind of use case, if it's really application wide, you could just fetch it once in index.ts and then export it from there, and then you can import the configuration in all the places you need it. Or then you could use mobx that we have documented in the documentation to have all those things in a store so that you would get updates for them and so on also.
Yeah. Then we got a last minute question kind of getting us full circle back to where we started. How about endpoints, REST?
Yep. So that goes to the backends for frontends thing. If you look at what you have with Hilla, kind of inspect the demo application we built in the network inspector, you will see that it very much looks like REST, but we don't want to make it complicated to create endpoints. We don't want to force you to define that this is the path, this is a post parameter, this is a get parameter, and so on. So we're not offering that configurability. Instead, we would recommend that if you want to have a third-party REST client to access your backend, there we see. And actually, if you zoom in, we see that it actually also goes to a save URL. Well, actually, we don't see that anywhere. Yeah, okay. Well, it's somewhere there. But yeah, in a way, it kind of looks like REST, but we haven't made it configurable so that you can define your own API schema there. So instead, definitely recommend using Spring MVC or REST controller or anything like that. to build a dedicated REST API for particularly the things that the REST clients would need.
Good.
Oh, now questions start flowing in. Do we have time still, or should we?
Let's answer one more question, and then we'll kind of do the rest. I'll put another banner up here to tell people to come to our Discord server and continue the discussion there anytime. So let's take one more question, and then we'll start wrapping up here.
The next one in line would be Kerberos integration for Vaadin ? Not really. It would be really great to have, but also the challenge is that everyone's Kerberos integration is different than anyone else's. So it's very much custom there. You can in general follow the kind of the same principle that you would use in the authentication documentation. It should be possible to also use that for Kerberos, but I'm afraid we don't even have an example on that.
Yeah, good. I think the last question we had was such a short one that I'll just say that if you want to create custom components, what we use ourselves and all the views are based on this lit library. So lit.dev contains all the kind of in-depth instructions and playgrounds and stuff for how to build standards-based web components using lit. Yeah. All right, but let's start wrapping up here.
There's another half of that question, using Flow. So you can integrate this with Flow also.
Good. All right. Yeah, I somehow missed that part of the question. But anyway, yeah, thanks a lot, Leif, for coming here. I think it was really kind of instructional to see both the code, but understand kind of what are the kind of design decisions that are behind that. Like, why did you build things that specific way, and what are the thoughts about having a front end and a back end so tightly integrated as opposed to like completely separate things. And I think just having those components there as an additional layer just makes things a lot quicker, because I can just tell a grid, here's a list of things I want you to show, and it shows them. So I don't have to go and search for another kind of third-party grid and see how do I integrate that into my specific stack. It's all there, so I can focus more on like, how do I actually build the functionality that I need in my application.
Yeah. So to summarize, why we built Hilla, we built it because we believe in feature teams using the backend for frontend pattern to build business applications with Spring Boot in a way that prioritizes developer productivity.
Yeah.
Easy. Good.
And I think one of the things you mentioned in your blog post too that's kind of worth mentioning is that we see that a lot of our users for Hilla will be people building these kind of business applications, like you mentioned, kind of business critical applications, and Hilla is supported by Vaadin the same way as Flow is. So if you do need enterprise support, hands-on help, kind of extended maintenance or warranty or anything, that is something that you can get for Hilla as well. So it is a kind of fully production ready and supported framework.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Leif. Thanks everyone for joining. It was a good webinar again. Let us know what you have, if you have any ideas for new topics or things you'd like to see. We're going to try to start creating some more content in terms of like tutorials and videos and stuff. So share your ideas with us so we know to kind of create the right kind of content. So yeah, thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.